Welcome everyone, and enjoy today's session of Reflect, Grow, Thrive, a webinar series hosted by YWCA in celebration of the International Day of the Girl Child. Before I begin, I of course have to give the welcome of country to the Indigenous people of Australia. This is probably one of my favourite parts of every single time that I speak at a presentation, because I grew up on Indigenous land, and I am also from an Indigenous country in the Middle East. So it is of utmost importance to myself to ensure that I am paying my respects to the Indigenous people. Whilst I acknowledge that we are, of course, all meeting on different parts of the Indigenous country that we call Australia, I pay my respects to all Indigenous people across the nation, but specifically I am joining from the Noongar Nation of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge that whilst we are all immigrants to this country, we also benefit from the colonisation of the land now that we call Australia. And we also have a shared responsibility to acknowledge the harm done to its First Nations and work towards respect and recognition. So welcome everyone. Today's session is of course one of my favorite sessions, because I have found that over the past couple of months, this topic has been of high prominence. This topic, as you all know, and as you have all probably seen and clicked on, is speaking about having these difficult conversations that unfortunately we are struggling with. Whilst we acknowledge that we are in 2020, 2020 has not only provided us with challenges, but it has also provided us with the notion that ignorance is a personal problem. We can no longer be complacent about the issues that are occurring across Australia and the world. We must speak about these issues that are affecting our disadvantaged brothers and sisters and non-sisters. So it is with my absolute pleasure that I am hosting and moderating this session with some of the most incredible women that I have had the privilege, or I will be having the privilege of speaking with today. So before we begin, and before I introduce you all to some incredible young women, I of course have to go over housekeeping. Closed captions are available next to the Q&A caption. If you look down below your screen, it should be on your right, on the right of your screen. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which we will be moderated throughout the session. We will have a 15-minute session dedicated to question and answers at the end of the session. However, please feel free to pop in your questions whenever you'd like. It doesn't need to be during that one time period. They can just come and go as you feel. We also will be recording today's session, and the recording will be shared in a couple of weeks' time after the webinar, just to make sure that those that did miss out are catching up with, I'm sure, the incredible discussions that we will be having today. As well as that, we acknowledge that some of the topics discussed during the Reflect, Grow, Thrive series may be sensitive, and they may resonate with yourself in different ways. If you need to take a break at any time, please do so. Grab a cup of coffee, turn off your camera, do what's most comfortable for yourself. YWCA staff are available at all times, so please feel free to message our colleagues via the email or via the Q&A with the private function if you'd like to chat. And finally, we will be sharing a survey on Friday afternoon, and we would love your feedback to hear about what you thought about these sessions and the other sessions that you attended this week. So I guess it's time to introduce some of the incredible young women on this panel today. But before I begin, I'd love to introduce myself. My name is Zahra, and I'm joining in, as I mentioned, from the Noongar country, Perth, Western Australia. And I am a part of the Young Women's Council of YWCA. And over the past year, I have worked with an incredible bunch of young women aged 12 to 30, and with the lovely Sara, to essentially represent young women's voices across Australia. As we know, young women's voices and adolescent voices, specifically girls, are left behind many of the conversations. So to hold the International Day of the Girl Child Reflect, Grow, Thrive webinar series. We are not only representing women and females and our non-binary people, but we are also representing the young women that have been left out from the surplus of conversations that have to relate to us. So this session will not only resonate with myself, but I'm sure it will resonate with a multitude and a plethora of different intersectional identities that are identified as young women. So now time to introduce the incredible panelists that I'm sure you will all love to hear from, and I'm sure we'll all be very privileged to hear from. First of all, I would like to introduce the incredible Sara Saleh. Sara Saleh is an Arab-Australian human rights activist, community organiser, writer and poet living on Gadigal land in Sydney. A long-time campaigner for refugee rights and racial justice, Sara has spent the last decade working with grassroots community and international organisations in Australia and across the Middle East. Sara's poems have been published in English and in Arabic in SBS Voices, Australian Poetry Journal, Minjin, Cordite Poetry Review, Bankstown Poetry Collection, and global anthologies A Blade of Grass, Making Mirrors, and Solid Air, an Australian New Zealand spoken word anthology. Oh my goodness, Sarah, you're making me nervous by reading all of this, but she has performed nationally and internationally from New Zealand to New York, and her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, SBS, and the ABC. She is the co-editor of the recently released anthology, Arab Australian Other, Stories on Race and Identity, a seminal collection of collective essays, memoirs, and poems which bring together 23 writers of Arab Australian backgrounds. She also sits on the board of Australia's largest advocacy organisation, Get Up, and is a proud Bankstown Poetry Slam ambassador. Carly Findlay. Carly Findlay, OAM, is an award-winning writer, speaker, and appearance activist. Her first book, a memoir called Say Hello, was released in Australia in January of 2019. She is also editing Growing Up Disabled in Australia with Black Ink Books out in February 2021. Carly works part-time as Melbourne's Fringe Access and Inclusion Coordinator. She writes on disability and appearance diversity issues for news outlets including the CNN, ABC, The Age, and Sydney Morning Herald, as well as SBS. She was named as one of Australia's most influential women in 2014, Australian Financial Review and Westpac's 100 Women of Influence Award. She has also appeared on ABC's TV, You Can't Ask That, and Cyber Hate with Tara Moss, and has been a regular on various ABC radio programs. She has also spoken at the Sydney Opera House, Melbourne Writers' Festival, the University of Western England, and Melbourne University, to name a few. She organised the History Making Access to Fashion, a Melbourne Fashion Week event featuring disabled models. She has a Masters of Communication, a Bachelor of E-Commerce, and Carly identifies as a proud disabled woman. She lives in Melbourne, Australia. And finally, the lovely Tessa Caramel. Originally hailing from the southwestern region of Western Australia, Tessa is a queer woman with a lifelong passion for championing the needs of LGBTIQ community. Interested in fostering respectful relationships with an education in gender studies, psychology, and sexology under her belt, Tessa is most in her element when helping to empower others to create positive change in their respective communities. Working within the not-for-profit, both domestically and internationally, for more than a decade has taught her how to fuel an individual's fire for change and foster an enduring sense of positivity within her work. Outside the -18, Tessa has an affinity for traveling with the world of fringe festivals and allowing the side hustle to justify her deep love for all things glittery and whimsical. When she's not under the big top, Tessa feels most at home by the ocean, but can be tempted to sit still almost any time by a stack of books on a rainy day. Now, as you can see, most of these incredible women are writers, and I'm sure that if we have any poets in the room, we're all clicking our fingers hearing the incredible passions that most of these women have. So I guess let's just jump right into it, and I'm sure everyone is just as excited as I am, right? I'm sure that we're all very keen to hear the multiple messages that we will take home to our respective Indigenous nation that we are standing on today. So I guess to begin, this is a question for the whole group, but I think I'll first of all start off with yourself, Tessa. I think the most notorious question of all that is often related with these challenging conversations is how we can actually have these challenging conversations. So in your experience, what makes a conversation challenging and how would you unpack that?
I tell you what, I have been ruminating on this question all week because there is so much within that. And I think in terms of the definition of a challenging conversation, that can take so many different forms as well. But I can only speak from personal experience and as a representative of minus 18. And I think a lot of the difficult conversations that we find our young people come into contact with is moments within which, as members of marginalized communities, they are already struggling to come to terms with being able to take up space with their identities. And often these conversations can come when they are in contact with people who would otherwise seek to dismiss those identities or reduce them. It is often an incredibly didactic, personal yet public intersectional experience that I think can be really overwhelming for a lot of people. And it's within that sense of being overwhelmed that that difficulty arises, I think, because there is the part of needing to look after yourself and stand your ground, but also wanting to advocate for other people in similar positions and represent your community as best you can. And that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah,
would you relate to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I know I shouldn't be putting in my input, but I certainly feel as though we're often placed in this little confined box where we're the representation of our own respective intersectional identity. As a Muslim woman myself, I know every single time that I step out of the house, I'm representing every single Muslim woman that wears the hijab. So I think I pass the mic on to Sara to see if you resonate in any way with what Tessa said.
Sure, if I can very quickly, salam everyone and good afternoon. I just want to echo Zara's earlier sentiments and begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. As she mentioned, I am on Gadigal land, land of the Eora Nations, and I'd like to pay my utmost respects to elders past and present and extend that to First Nations people joining us here today. I think it's just very important, given my own people, Palestinian, Egyptian, Lebanese people's history of oral storytelling, that I do this because I am in fact very grateful, thankful for the spaces that we have online and off to be able to so generously share our stories and our learnings with each other. To answer your question, Zara, which is, so easy. One of those like things, just the burden of representation of the entire community. I think that, it is a lived reality that whether you like it or not, you do carry that, you do shoulder that, and just by virtue of, your physical appearance, you embody, as you said, a very politicized identity. And I think the difference then becomes whether you choose to own that and define that and how you carry that versus whether you want people to impose their own projections and opinions and assumptions on you, and whether they define that space for you. So I think that that's really the key thing for me here. So I don't want to go out there and represent, nor do I proclaim that I go out there and represent my entire community and all Muslim women and all Muslim women wearing hijab, because I think that just sets us up to fail. It's an impossible thing. So I think rather than trying to be perfect all the time and trying to be mindful of that and play into that like model, migrant, model Muslim woman issue, I think it's really important to make sure that you are very aware of who you are and you are defining those parameters and going out there like on your own terms, I guess. So you choose to define yourself as opposed to let other people define you. I think because at the end of the day, the thing that I wanted to say was, I don't want others to have to constantly live up to others' positive or negative views of me. Like, if I want to be excellent, great. If I want to be mediocre, also great. That's up to me. If I choose that, then I choose that. But again, it shouldn't be because I'm trying to play into other people's notions or preconceived ideas or definitions of what a Muslim woman, hijabbed or otherwise, should be or should behave like.
Well said, Sarah. I think you definitely encapsulate all the thoughts in my mind, which often get swirled up in a tornado. Yeah. Carly, do you have anything else to add in terms of disability community? I know this is probably one of the most underrepresented, or rather young people with disabilities that aren't often included within these challenging conversations, and we essentially just skip over it. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, I am on Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation, and I too pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. As a writer, I always like to give a shout out to other Aboriginal writers. So do go buy or borrow the books by Claire Coleman, Tara June Winch, Gail Kennedy, to name a few. Yeah, I find it challenging, I guess, to get ensure that disabled people have a space at the table to start with, because the table is often inaccessible to us or we've forgotten about. When people talk about diversity, in the recent diversity, I think Media Diversity Australia study, they talked all about different types of diversity except for disability. So, disability is often the forgotten part of diversity. But I find as a disabled woman, it can be really hard to have conversations around disability, particularly around ableism, which is discrimination towards disabled people, in terms of language, because people defend their right to use ableist language. So disability slurs like the R word are often used because people justify it by saying that language has evolved. And so it can be really hard to talk to a friend who is otherwise, somewhat a good person, and they still justify the use of those slurs because it's their right to use them and language has evolved. And I think because disability is so underrepresented, it can be tricky to have conversations if you're the only one in the room, if you're thinking that you're never going to be invited back because you don't want to be seen as the difficult person. I had an experience on ABC radio a few years ago when a broadcaster, who I do not name, was very rude to me, and he asked me some really inappropriate questions, and the interview was live, and I felt like I didn't quite know what to do. If I'd stormed out, that would have made headlines. I stayed, it still made headlines. And then I wasn't invited back to the ABC for some time after having a regular voluntary guest spot on a number of shows. And it really showed that through me speaking up, that's the way I did in the media afterwards, I was seen as a really difficult person for calling that out, because, while I would have expected somebody like a shock jock on a commercial station to say that, I certainly didn't expect someone from the ABC who has, the ABC has such good codes of conduct and diversity codes and stuff to behave that way. So yeah, it can be really hard to call that out if you're never going to be invited back. And also one of the things, as Sara said, we can be expected to represent all people. I often talk about the idea of not being curious and asking questions, because curiosity about someone's appearance or race or gender or sexuality or disability can be really tiring if you're on the receiving end. And I've had people say to me when I've set these boundaries and said, no, I will not answer your curious questions about my appearance. And then they'll say, well, we're never going to talk to someone with a facial difference or skin condition or disability again. So I can't be expected to set that rule for someone. It has to be people reading widely, learning different experiences and perspectives, and not relying on the model minorities to give them all the answers.
Can I just add to that? I think that Yeah, that was actually it really resonated with me, because I think growing up a lot of the time, especially in a kind of post 9/11 Cronulla riot kind of environment and so on, I felt like my Muslimness, there was like a carte blanche publicly. So people would come up and ask me all sorts of quite invasive questions. And I was 16, 18, 20, 21, so really quite young. And I didn't feel comfortable nor well equipped to answer these really, big existential questions, let alone questions that were personal or asked by strangers, especially when the power dynamic was quite skewed. So people felt that they were entitled or gave themselves the right to come and ask me all these questions. And I had to learn. At first I felt embarrassed. I was like, oh, I better answer this question, because I don't want them to think all Muslims are bad or rude, or because you feel that burden, as we were saying earlier, of representation. But then of course eventually you learn and you realize that it's not on you, it's on them. And unfortunately the boundary setting is on you at times, and that can be challenging when the power dynamic is quite skewed. But you grow, and sometimes you are forced to mature in these situations very quickly, quicker than you care to, and have these kinds of difficult, sometimes maybe racist conversations or questions, that you're offending. So I guess on that note, I just want to say one of the things that I have found very helpful, because of course not everyone is going to come up to me, whether I know them or not, with such entitlement or such difficult questions. And at times it is a curiosity, it is well-meaning, it is caring, it is how can I help, all these things that we kind of have experienced, I'm sure, in a range of areas, not just my Muslimness. But I think what often is a good way to kind of approach it is whether you're in a safe space, or whether you're creating a safe space or aiming to be in one. And so I guess, if you guys want to talk about that, we can. But for me personally, just having that definitely helps, knowing that there are these rules, unspoken or spoken, that are creating and feeding into like this concept or notion of a safe space and safe relationship to have these conversations, definitely helps.
Yeah, I think because most of our work, well, most of my work is online, and it can be really hard to set those boundaries. I get a lot of people message me or copy me into complaints they write about all types of things, mostly disability related. But I thought, I mean, one, it's a privilege to be thought of in that way, that someone wants to entrust you with their issue or needs your help. But I am but one person, and I don't particularly want to be copied into every email somebody sends to Bill Shorten about disability discrimination. And I think for me, it's about providing the information and resources so that other people can go and be activists. I often say, if I've taught you anything, don't tell me about the disability discrimination you see online. Like, call it out yourself. Go and write to the media about it. I don't need to be tagged in it 7 times and be subject to that trauma again. I particularly find when there are really bad, and generally there are really bad stories about ichthyosis, people with the skin condition I have, they're always hideous. Like the language that they use in the headlines and the othering in the copy, and the way the parents are always, saying that it's a massive tragedy that their child has ichthyosis. Every time there's a story about ichthyosis, I'm tagged on Facebook or Twitter, and I've seen it. I have a Google alert for ichthyosis, but I also don't want to see it, and I don't want to see another article about ichthyosis unless I've written it myself, because they're so awful. And so I don't think people understand the impact of them telling you about this, and then projecting that trauma onto you and expecting you to do something with it. I had a person overnight ask me for my email address, and they wanted to send me a thing about some discrimination they've seen. And I said to them outright, I'm not the right person to send this to. Send it to this website, so I sent them a government website, and hopefully they do something with that. But I don't want to be burdened with everything that people feel like they should put on me.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Carly, thank you so much for that. I think most of the women on this panel right now, I feel like we have a lot of lived trauma, and it takes a lot to even utilize your voice. So I think it is just as important to even recognize that the power of your voice, and to even have the strength to utilize your voice, is incredible beyond words. It's not just about taking those extra actions to create the reform that we are after, but it's just waking up every morning and continuing to fight, because this is a never-ending battle for most of us, and it is a never-ending battle for many intersectional identities, not just within Australia but across the world. I think I might jump to you, Tessa, again. As we are speaking about creating that change and having those challenging conversations, do you have a regular approach or a game plan that you use when you're having these challenging conversations with difficult people? I know it's very tough, and sometimes it's like speaking to a brick wall, but do you have any tips or tricks for the audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really great question. But before I answer that, I do want to apologize, because I have not taken the time yet to extend my acknowledgement of the land that I am on as well. I just want to send my respects to the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation that I am grateful to live and conduct my work on. From Naarm, otherwise known as Melbourne, here we are. I know there's a few of us coming from around here, but thank you for that time, and thank you for the privilege to be able to be here today. Now, in terms of your game plan for these kinds of questions, I personally work as a workshop presenter for LGBTQIA+ issues, which means that we're often in front of audiences of hundreds of people who do have that advantage of almost anonymity in terms of feeling comfortable asking questions that do directly speak to your identity and almost completely invalidate your humanity, and that you kind of just become a vessel for information at that point. And the extent to with which that happens on a regular basis, you do kind of have to come up with this game plan, or almost like a working process for yourself, because I think that as a concept also adds a buffer between yourself and the person asking questions, because at that point, by shifting the perspective of the fact that, as I think it was you that mentioned, Carly, that they're not wanting to speak to you necessarily as an individual personally, they're just wanting information because they see you as someone who has that, and that in itself is something that you want to, you know, pay heed to and understand that they're trying, and that's something that if you push that back, similarly to the kinds of experiences you had with people who then immediately shut themselves off, that's a risk that as advocates you're not necessarily willing to take sometimes, because we need all the help we can get in these kinds of areas. And I think navigating that balance between understanding that the interaction that you have with this person may or may not necessarily dictate how much further they go into exploring their allyship is a significant amount of weight, and it's a lot of responsibility, whether or not you want it. I think in terms of the way that I often approach these conversations is quite a somatic thing. We were speaking a lot about the idea of these kinds of conversations being draining and crossing boundaries and extending into the personal, and at that point it becomes harmful. But when I go into a place where I'm either expecting these questions are going to be asked, or I'm encountering an experience where that is going to be happening, I'll kind of get it into a very much like bodily state, extending my own awareness to my own personal level of safety, which means understanding my level of vulnerability on that given day, which will change. As you said, Sara, there are some days that you are like, I am excellent. There are some days I am mediocre, and that is totally okay. But trying to give myself the space to check in with where that is and to what extent I'm willing to give energy to this conversation, I think is a really protective process that I've learned to kind of bring into almost muscle memory at this point. But I think one of the things that is difficult to speak to often is that for a lot of people, navigating where their boundaries are, which we were speaking about, being in a position of being able to do here in the experiences that we have day to day, how do you get to that point? How do you get to being somebody who understands where your boundaries are and understands how to uphold them? And I think that as a process is something that we try to teach with our young people, but in that the key point of that is allowing yourself to have humanity and understand that you are an individual, and that just because a person sees you as a representative of a particular community does not necessarily mean that that is all that you are reduced to. Allowing yourself to take up space, but also simultaneously be human and be soft and be fallible is this really strange balance, but it's something that I think allowing yourself to acknowledge can be really helpful.
Absolutely, I definitely share your sentiments, Tessa. Carly, I'll pass the mic on to you. You seem a bit excited to answer this one.
Yeah, I related so much to what Tessa said there, and I feel like because of a lot of what I talk about is my own experience, and it is a lot of appearance related stuff. I can set the boundaries about how much I want to share, but then people would like to take more than I want to give. And it can often be really, the interaction I get from people, particularly like because my workplace is online, and then, you know, when we were allowed to do public events, it'll be speaking at a public event. Generally people are fine and they know who I am, but if they happen to just stumble across it, or you know, if their partner took them to that event and they didn't know what it was about or whatever, I often get really strange questions that other speakers, that my colleagues don't receive. So for an example, one Women's Day I spoke at a council, and I spoke with two people, Celeste Little, who is an Aboriginal woman, and also Jo Stanley, who is a white woman. And after the event, there was a person there who must have seen me scratching. My skin gets really itchy, and that like wasn't part of my speech. I didn't talk about why I was itchy. You know, it's just obviously a bodily reflex that I do without thinking. And as I was having a drink afterwards, so still in work mode but a bit social, a woman came up to me and she started scratching my arm. And I looked at her and I said, what are you doing? And she says, I just thought that you'd need a scratch because you were scratching on stage. And I said, no,
Wow.
like, you know, that you're invading my personal space. And I asked both Jo and Celeste if that happened to them, and they said no. So I get this level of like intrusion, and it's really hard in a work thing, because I think, you know, can I just tell them to F off? You know, will I still get paid for this? Who are they? And I did tell someone there what had happened. Like I told one of the organisers, and they were really angry, but by the time I told them the person had left. But it's really awkward to know how to set those boundaries and still be polite and liked, and yeah, and knowing that this doesn't happen to other people, like it just doesn't, the othering that disabled women feel, and I think it might be the same for Muslim women as well, is not the same as for most other people. When I told Celeste, who I'm sure experiences her fair share amount of othering, you know, she was surprised, so you know, supportive, but you know, it didn't happen to her. It didn't happen to Jo. It didn't happen to any other person there that I know of. So it was a really weird experience to be invaded that way.
My solidarity, Carly. That I'm absolutely shocked, and
Thank you.
I think that exactly, like my reaction to being shocked essentially perpetuates the ideology and the notion that disabled women are often othered. And I think we need to start recognizing that disabled women, specifically disabled young women and disabled adolescents as well, are often treated like the other. And I think that there's not enough discourse and there's not enough dialogue about the issues, which ultimately goes back to the discussion that we had earlier about how we're not making enough space on the table. Sara, I'd like to pass on to you. I'm sure you have an incredible insight to add.
Yeah, I was just listening to Carly and got goosebumps from that story, and it of course reminded me of times that I have indeed been touched you know, by people without my consent. And honestly, it does make me pretty angry to think about it, and I have gotten angry when people, particularly of you know, let's say men who have touched me, but also just anyone, a stranger that I have not permitted to invade the space, whether it's and you know, touching that, or whether it's other types of, and it is, as Carly said, the burden then becomes on you. How am I going to react? Am I going to be outraged, and rightfully so, and then risk what does that risk? Or am I going to let this person know that this is not okay? And can I do that in a way that, still is respectful and preserves both my dignity and that person's dignity as well? So look, it's a call. And I think sometimes people react, and it's really difficult to judge someone for reacting if they've been put in a position that they're really uncomfortable or unfamiliar with. But having said that, I mean, for me, again, because it's something that you get used to, sadly, you get very good at being clear about your boundaries and letting that person know, listen, I'm uncomfortable with you touching me this way. Please don't touch me again like that, and so on. And I've had instances where they have gaslit me and said that, it was nothing, or it didn't mean anything, or that, I shouldn't get that mad. So again, like dictating how I should feel about the, initial violation. And so that also upsets you further. But again, for me, it's about just being able to be very explicit and clear about where I stand and why I'm not okay with it. And then you just really need to know when you are going to draw the line. So I'm not going to sit there and argue and try to convince them as to why it's not okay. If they don't recognize it or don't apologize, then, there's a line, and you might take further action in the same way that Carly did, or find an alternative, for example. But I did very quickly want to go back to what Tessa was saying as well, in thinking about having sort of these difficult conversations. I do think it's important to very broadly discern the audience that you're speaking to, and base kind of that in some way, like that would dictate a lot of the conversation for me. In some of my Palestinian justice advocacy and campaigning, I come across people who we call progressives except for Palestine, and there are people who are progressive only on Palestine. So PEPs and POOPs. So PEPs might be people who are progressive on all sorts of issues, but then draw the line and stop on Palestine because for them that's a really difficult thing. It mixes with other Islamophobia and Arabphobia and other sort of vested interests that I won't go into. So progressives tend to be people on the left, let's put it that way, people that we might mix with in our own spaces. Then there's the progressives, as I mentioned, only on Palestine, so POOPs, and they tend to be people in their own community who want to talk about Palestine.
I think we've lost Sara.
I can never tell if it's my internet connection or someone else.
Mine too.
No, Sara.
I think we'll just wait a couple of seconds just to see if she'll connect back. That was such a good discussion that she was just about to get into.
I feel like I'm on the edge, just waiting.
Yeah. All right. I think we'll touch back onto Sara as soon as she gets back in. Yep, she's disconnected. So I think we'll just give her time. But I think going on to this quick question whilst we wait for Sara to come back into the chat and give us her words of knowledge. I guess I'll start with yourself, Tessa. What are some strategies that she's back?
Ooh.
Perfect.
Sorry, we have disruptions all around because of NBN stuff. It's not something that I can help. I do apologize, but it shouldn't happen again. Is that clearer?
It's all good, Sara. Go ahead.
And I guess I'm just going to keep talking about poops. So, poops are a particular type of person in my community, that old uncle or so on that just cares about Palestine, but is problematic on all sorts of other issues and doesn't want to extend that basic, those human rights and that kind of vision. So isn't as intersectional, I guess is what I'm saying. So for me, how I speak to someone who is in some of the spaces here that we're mixing with versus, that old uncle is going to be very different. And I think that thinking about you know, your demeanor and your approach is important, and not to tone police, but I think if your objective is to an extent to get them to see and understand something that maybe they didn't have access on, you know, to knowledge and information understanding, then if that's your objective, as opposed to I'm right and you're wrong, and that's okay too. But you know, then you're gonna have to think about your approach and how you, you know, tailor the conversation to that. The other thing, and language matters, as we know, language matters. Framing matters. I don't want this to sound like a box ticking exercise, but when I speak to someone like my mom about issues that she might not necessarily, or didn't grow up necessarily learning about, might not necessarily understand at this point, or isn't exposed to, because she hasn't had the luxury of education in the same way that I have, hasn't had the luxury of meeting all sorts of people, learning all sorts of things, even the time to just go out and do the research yourself. All these things have not been accessible to her for all sorts of barriers. Like, I'm not going to talk to my mom about Fanon. You know, I'm not going to drop, hi mom, human rights are important because the UDHR and ICCPR say so. Sorry for my use of acronyms. I'm going to tell her that people deserve to have food on the table. You know, children deserve to go to school in the same way that I did. We deserve to have a roof over our heads. You know, that's the sort of language that I would probably use depending on who I'm speaking to. I do want to say that ultimately, and I'll end on this note, that there's like, I think you generally know yourself and can read kind of the room and the audience and figure out where this is going, and you know when to stop. I'm not interested in people who play devil's advocate in a sense where it's actually quite harmful and is actually putting the labor on me and making me do the work, or re-traumatizing me to an extent. So if you're genuinely interested and want to learn, great. But if you're playing devil's advocate because you're trying to one-up me or trying to corner me into something when I'm talking about lived experience or issues that, you know, are pretty important, I'm not going to buy into that. The other thing is, I guess, again, you have to know when to stop, because ultimately, if you've had this conversation time and again with that one racist uncle, let's say, and it really hasn't made a difference, then unfortunately that's one of those things where you have to call it and put your energy into maybe other more productive things, because ultimately you don't want to be harming yourself. You don't want to keep doing the draining labor if there isn't, you know, like a point, I suppose.
Well said, Sara. We are running quick on time, Sara, but I just wanted to quickly ask you a double-up question, because it is International Day of the Girl Child, and this webinar is to ensure that we are reaching adolescents and young girls specifically. A specific thought that came to my mind whilst you were speaking, and first of all, let me preface that your words absolutely hit so close to home, but something that you were speaking about earlier was how you have these difficult conversations and how they're often too hard. I remember growing up when I was in high school, when I was in primary school, apologies, and I started wearing the hijab, the boys would play who can pull off Zahra's hijab off first. And it was a game that they'd play in primary school. And I guess something that all three speakers have spoken about is having difficult conversations, but these conversations are often had with older young people, as you call them. So how do you have these conversations with young people? Because I honestly think that discrimination really roots off at your young adolescent years, and these conversations are often very difficult to have with young children that are only 10 or 11 that really don't understand the power behind their words. Because we are about to hit off question and answer, I'd love to touch on all three of the moderators. So Sara, could I start off with yourself first?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Islamophobic and sexist, delightful. So I think that with trying to have these conversations with younger people, based on my experiences, I do think that you need to meet young people sort of in the middle, or in a way speak to their interests. And so one of the things that I have done in the past many times is through poetry workshops. So I think putting aside the fact that young people have a whole range of issues that they're experiencing that at this point in time I'm not experiencing, of course, now that I'm a little bit older, but also that I might have experienced, or that I will never, so different experiences dictate. So I think it's about laying the groundwork to ensure that they have the agency to voice these experiences, to understand them, to express them in these different ways, make sense of them. I think that's what a lot of young people are lacking, the tools to do so. So poetry workshops for me have been a great way to connect with young people, to have these really difficult conversations, and to use poetry as a tool to do that, so that they can reflect on their own privileges, responsibilities, and oppressions, to put it loosely. And then also then through that, I often say imagination and empathy are the highest form of intellect. So that's why storytelling for me, poetry, these kinds of artistic avenues, not biased, do allow for that empathy, that understanding to grow, so that they know and they know that there are people out there who care about them and acknowledge their hurts, because that's a lot of the time where it's coming from. And then also that there are others who they are hurting, that they need to understand and kind of be aware of. And through that, you build these spaces and these connections. So poetry has been a really wonderful way for me to do that. And a lot of the times, this is a very gendered thing, but the younger, young boys, especially, again, from experience, always come back to me with, oh, poetry's, super lame, or it's really girly, that kind of toxic masculinity. And you have to have these conversations where you say, well, the greatest, speaking to their language, the greatest hip hop artists, rappers, musicians, like, who do you listen to? Oh, Tupac. Okay, well then, this is poetry. And just, I guess, package it in a way, or make it accessible to them, because they don't want to listen to a dead white guy, aka Shakespeare. Like, I'm sorry, that's not relatable to them. You need to meet them where they're at. I think a lot of the times that seems to do the trick.
So thank you so much, Sara. Because we are running short on time, I think I might just jump into Q&A. I'll start with yourself, Tessa. How do you have conversations as an emotional person? Lovely question by Madeline. I think sometimes I often cry. I'm a very emotional person, and I often find myself crying whilst I speak. So do you have any tips or tricks?
I relate to that so deeply. Oof. And I think especially a lot of the difficulty with this, simultaneously, in terms of your own inner experience, and that sometimes coming into an emotional place can make it feel difficult to express yourself in the way that you might otherwise want to, but also understanding that we are living under a patriarchal discourse, which does then just frame any kind of emotional response that we have as being lesser than or not worth listening to. And I think in order to directly oppose that, acknowledging that you are an emotional person and giving yourself the right to understand that as a strength is so powerful. Coming to places where conversations are being had in a very objective, almost disconnected way, as somebody who has an emotional lens over their understanding of advocacy, is honestly, at this point, not something that people are really used to experiencing, and it can be quite confronting for a lot of others, but I don't think that's a bad thing. One of the main things that we do in our workshops is create spaces that are empathy and feeling centered, because within that, you're encouraging the people that are in that learning space to sit within their emotions. And that can be that can be an uncomfortable space to sit in. But by teaching them to lean into discomfort with, as you mentioned earlier, Carly, curiosity, that's where the learning really happens. And what we try to do, as, say, for example, as for myself, someone who is quite an emotional person, I try to encourage other people to understand that they can come into that place of emotion with me. And they're often quite scared of it. But if you can encourage them to see that you're able to sit in discomfort, and that by being curious about that discomfort, you're able to take yourself into new places of learning that you wouldn't have otherwise accessed, you can show them a pathway to new understandings that they might not have necessarily been shown before. And I just want to preface that by saying this is a superpower and it is strength, and I highly encourage you to harness it, find stories, listen to other people that feel similarly to you, because it is important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's the beautiful words as well. Carly, I think I might jump to you. Can you discuss about how your disability has allowed you to become an ally to other communities during difficult conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have empathy in being a marginalised person, but it doesn't mean I understand, you know, the discrimination that a Muslim woman faces, for example. I have only just experienced racism for the first time, which is, my mum is South African, so I identify as a woman of colour, but it's not obvious because my face is red because of my skin problem, my skin condition rather. And yeah, it's been a weird thing to be on the receiving end, but also talk about race issues. And I guess because that's been an identity that I've only kind of newly explored, because for so long my skin was difficult to manage, and you know, it took a lot to accept a different appearance. It's been a relatively recent thing, and so some people have seen that as opportunistic, which has been really hard. So I think it is about listening to somebody and acknowledging that while we don't share the same kinds of like identities, we share the same sorts of social barriers. So in disability, there's a social model of disability, which I guess could be applied to other identities, where the body is not the problem, it's the accessibility that's the problem. So barriers that are put up around, like physical barriers, building barriers, and then also attitudinal barriers, these can be removed to help you know, create more accessibility. And I think that, you know, another marginalized person might experience racism, and so our feelings of that can be really similar. I don't know whether I've explained myself well enough here, but I think we can empathize and show that we are allies. I certainly try to amplify Black voices on my social media, for example. I don't see enough representation in skin condition communities of Black people, so I've been handing over my Instagram to people who are Black and with skin conditions, and just reading and researching and not expecting other people to do the work, because we know how hard it is to do the work. So doing the work ourselves for other communities.
Perfectly worded, Carly. As I mentioned previously, I think 2020 has all taught us that ignorance is a personal problem, and we have access to so many educational resources that if one is going to turn a blind eye, that's on them. That's on their ignorance. So perfectly worded. Final question, as we are very close to wrapping up. I'll pass the mic to Sara. What are the processes that you went through to use or to learn about where your boundaries are? Mute.
No, I was just reflecting. The processes to learn where my boundaries are.
Yeah.
I think boundaries generally are quite dynamic. You know, they're not, for me, they're not always fixed. It really depends on where I'm at, generally speaking. So as I said before, some days where I'm feeling good, my boundaries might be a little, you know, the tolerance is a little higher than lower. But essentially, I think you learn this through a couple of ways. One, again, just very quickly, experience, your own intuition and how you've navigated difficult situations and how you've grown and learned from them. So being introspective, self-reflection, really important, checking in with yourself, all the kind of self-care self-care, and for me, collective community care, which is probably the second point, AKA support systems. So having support systems, talking to people who know you, learning from them, that kind of thing, reaching out, I think is all super important. And again, informs your own thinking around and feeling around what boundaries are right for you.
Can I just say as well, this is a conversation about difficult conversations, and while you might not know it, there's been a couple of words here that are disability slurs that have been used today, which you might not be aware about. The term lame can be quite damaging to people who walk differently to you, and also the term turn a blind eye, that can also be quite problematic, and it's ableist towards blind people. So there are so many words that we just use as figures of speech, and they're ingrained into our vernacular. There's a really great resource online called Autistic Hoya, by Autistic Hoya. If you Google Autistic Hoya ableist language, you'll find a whole heap of things that you didn't know are ableist, and some alternatives to use.
Thank you so much, Carly, and I'm so apologetic if anything has been said today that has been triggering or offensive whatsoever. As I think, as we have been speaking about today, most of the conversations that we have are often microaggressions, I guess, as well, and we often don't recognize the power of our words. And as we have noted today, we have had so many powerful discussions, and I guess it can work on both ends of the spectrum. It can have a negative impact or a positive impact. So my sincerest apologies if anything has been said. I definitely will, I'm sure that the YWCA team will be sure to link the resource that you have provided with the webinar that we will be posting online. So with that, we come to an end of the incredible discussions that we've had. First of all, I would like to thank everyone that has joined us today for this webinar. I'd also love to thank Tessa, Carly, and Sara for their time and for sharing their insights and expertise with us today. You've definitely given the audience a lot to consider, and I definitely am walking away with a lot of insights. I'm just about to go to class, and I can definitely reassure you all that I probably have learned a lot more within these panel discussions than within most of my classes. So it is beyond a privilege, as per usual, to be speaking to some incredible powerhouses within this room. Thank you so much to everyone that has joined, and please keep an eye out for the other webinars that we will be hosting over the rest of the week. The next one will be held today at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Please keep in mind daylight savings has been changing a lot of the time, so double check. But once again, have a lovely rest of the day, everyone, and thank you for joining.